Hello and welcome. How realistic are the fears surrounding nuclear power, and what impact is Japan's reactor crisis going to have on the future of atomic energy? The massive earthquake last Friday, which triggered explosions at the Fukushima nuclear facility, has led to concerns of massive radiation leakage and prompted other countries to review their own nuclear plants. Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel has ordered safety checks and announced that 7 of the country's nuclear plants will be temporarily shut down. In France, which relies on nuclear technology for 80% of its power needs, legislators have ordered an investigation into, quote, the future of the industry. China also says it's suspending approvals for planned nuclear power facilities. So today we ask, as fears of lethal radiation mount in Japan, what are the arguments for and against atomic energy? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Well, joining me to discuss these issues are William Tucker, a nuclear energy advocate based in New York. He's the author of the book, Terrestrial Energy: How Nuclear Energy Will Lead the Green Revolution and End America's Energy Odyssey. And here in the studio with me is Damon Moglen, the Climate and Energy Director for Friends of the Earth. He's worked on climate, energy and nuclear issues for nearly 20 years. Gentlemen, I welcome you both to the show.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you.
Very good.
Mr. Tucker, I'd like to start with you, sir, and ask, considering how meticulous the Japanese are when it comes to safety and details and those kind of issues, how has this incident in Fukushima made you rethink, perhaps, in any way, your position on nuclear energy?
Well, I think they've done a reasonably good job of anticipating. The containment structures did survive one of the largest earthquakes in history. So they can certainly take credit for that. There was this chain of events, though, with the tsunami and the electrical power outage that led to the current situation. Now, I'm certainly not going to say that they shouldn't have thought of this, or it isn't. But I think overall, nuclear power is an evolving technology. These are very old reactors. Most of the new reactors are specifically designed to overcome this design flaw where you need to have electricity to keep the cooling system going. So I think the way with nuclear now, the way forward is to simply go forward with an evolving technology, right, and accept the fact that nuclear power offers an awful lot of energy at a reasonly small price, right, and we're going to need it.
Let me ask you, Mr. Tucker, then, considering the sort of psyche of the public right now, Japan is downplaying the risk of high-level radiation leakage, but if, God forbid, something happens and there's large leakage affecting the communities nearby, surely it's going to be hard to claw back any credibility for nuclear energy.
Well, that will be very difficult, yes, but you have to recognize that most of the concerns about what's going to happen evolve out of the idea that a reactor is really a bomb. It's waiting to explode there, and somehow there's going to be a nuclear holocaust. The words holocaust, disaster, catastrophe just roll off everybody's tongue. What we're talking about with a meltdown is basically a destruction of the reactor. The reactor won't be able to be used again. It's a total loss. But as far as for releases, radiation, that's an entirely different thing. And at 3 Mile Island, the containment held up completely. Here, there has been a crack in the containment, and there have been moderate releases. But it's certainly very dangerous for the workers. But as far as the general public, so far, thank goodness, there hasn't been any wide exposures yet. All
right, let me bring in Damon Moglen here. Good to have you with us as well.
Thank you, Riz.
Let me ask you, how do you balance the need for energy that doesn't affect the climate, like fossil fuels, established obviously the damage being done there, and the desire to move away from nuclear power as you would like to?
Well, look, I think that this accident makes something incredibly clear, which is that nuclear reactors are not safe and they're not clean. And we really face some difficult decisions, but I think that what we do see is that we can put coal, 19th century technology, behind us, and that nuclear is really a 20th century technology which we also must put behind us. And where that takes us is renewable technology and also efficiency. And these are technologies of the 21st century that I think have huge opportunities The real question is that it's going to take a significant commitment to get these technologies up to scale.
Yeah.
But I think that if you look at what China is doing, you see getting up to scale in a very dramatic and effective way.
Right now, with the huge demands that countries like China, India, Brazil, the developing nations face in terms of energy needs, it's very, very hard to realistically see a short-term future replacement of any kind of energy system with those renewables that you're talking about.
Well, I think all you have to do, for example, is look at the Chinese program, where they actually are investing tens, hundreds of billions of dollars in these technologies, and they're getting somewhere fast without necessarily having to use old technologies that create nuclear waste or create the kind of climate-changing pollution which we also have to be worried about from something like coal.
Mr. Tucker,
how do you explain?
Go ahead, sir. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me ask a question. How do you explain the fact that China is building 20 is far ahead of us in building reactors now?
Well, I think
they're.
I think first of all, Mr. Tucker, we should talk about the facts, which is the Chinese government has announced today that because of this accident, they're actually suspending their new development of technology of the reactors. But I think really more importantly,
well, that'll probably last about a week.
Well, we'll see. But Mr. Tucker, I think that what we see happening in Japan is now going to last for weeks and months probably. So I don't think.
I think the Chinese. I'm saying the Chinese suspension will last about a week. I'll bet you'll be over in a month.
So I was going to ask you, Mr. Tucker, you know, from what I gather, there's something like 30 countries with around 440 nuclear plants. On what scale has that commitment to nuclear grown around the world recently?
Well, there are 65 reactors under construction in the world right now, 20 of them in China. We're undergoing a world nuclear renaissance. The only place you don't see this happening is Germany and the United States. All these countries, Russia, Korea, India, Japan, are all committed. Not only 4 of them are not only building their own reactors, they're selling them to countries all over the world. And I don't think anybody's going to go back on this, because there isn't any other way to provide this kind of energy for large numbers of people.
Riz, if I may, I'd like to just respond, which is there's absolutely no nuclear renaissance in North America nor in Western Europe. And it needs to be pointed out that those
You're
are
right.
all,
It's in Asia.
Excuse me, Mr. Tucker. Mr. Tucker, you're going to need to let me finish. That there is absolutely no renaissance whatsoever in the countries that have actually been operating nuclear power over decades. And those are the countries which know that nuclear power is not safe and it's not clean and they can't deal with the nuclear waste.
One thing I do have to ask you, Mr. Moglen, though, is over the years there have been obviously some very highly publicized nuclear incidents. We had Windscale, of course, in the UK, 3 Mile Island, which Mr. Tucker mentioned in the USA, the only fatal nuclear accident, Chernobyl, which took place in '86 in Ukraine, in the former Soviet Union. The death toll is actually really relatively low from those when you compare it with what happens in the fossil fuel industry.
Well, I must differ with you on that. For example, the Russian Academy of Sciences has said that we have hundreds of thousands of dead from Chernobyl in Russia, and that's probably going to turn out to be a conservative figure. I think that what we have to realize about nuclear accidents and radiation accidents is that we don't see an immediate blast effect. We don't see lots of dead right away. But what we do see is cancer setting in 18, 20, 25 years down the line. And that's why we're now at a state where we have hundreds of thousands dead, according to the Russian government itself, from Chernobyl, for example.
Mr. Tucker, I have to ask about the way nuclear governments are stepping back from governments, sorry, are stepping back from nuclear power.
Can I go back with this hundreds and thousands of Russians dead? I mean, the United Nations did a whole 3-year, 4-year study on it. They said there were 60 deaths from Chernobyl. There were about 6,000 cancers, and perhaps there might be 20,000 cancers lifetime over the whole
Mr.
world.
Mr. Tucker's facts are simply wrong, and even the International Atomic Energy Agency.
Those aren't my facts.
No, the International Atomic Energy Agency itself has many multiples more dead, Mr. Tucker, than you're talking about. I think you need to get your facts right.
Okay, well, listen, I mean, assuming that there is obviously still debate over the numbers and the effect, let me ask you, Mr. Tucker, with governments stepping back as they have been right now, Angela Merkel closing down those plants, France obviously reviewing the situation, China too, let me ask you what impact do you think that this incident in Japan is going to have long-term on the future of nuclear energy?
Well, it depends on how the event turns out. If there is a catastrophic release of radiation right now and whole sections of Japan are made uninhabitable, I think it will have an impact. Who knows what's going to happen? Right now it doesn't. But I think my guess would be that it's going to have a small impact. It'll be a bump in the road, But I think a year or two from now, most countries will be back to building reactors like that.
Well, if I may say, I think this is shameful. For example, the head of the French Nuclear Safety Agency, who's very pro-nuclear, has said that this is a catastrophe. This is a catastrophe of the highest order. And I think that to suggest it's a, quote, bump in the road is to really attempt to limit what is an extraordinary crisis and a huge amount of human suffering right now in Japan. And I think it's
now, of course, what we're also looking
there's
at,
a huge amount of human suffering from an earthquake and a tidal wave. I don't think the nuclear incident is causing a huge amount of suffering.
I think you really need to be watching television as millions of people around the world are, Mr. Tucker.
Let me get both of you a couple of email questions, starting with Mr. Tucker. I've got a question that came in from a viewer who wrote about the Fukushima incident from our Facebook page. Vele Mefefu wrote in saying, Japan was reckless in building its plants. A serious discussion of this subject is needed. I have to ask you, isn't it a bit of a risk choosing a location that has such seismic activity, Mr. Tucker?
Well, there aren't many places in Japan that are not susceptible to seismic activity. It's called the Ring of Fire. So again, the reactors survived the earthquake. They did not survive the tsunami, the loss of the electric generators that were supposed to cool, that have to cool the plant afterwards. They have, since the 1990s, the industry has been designing reactors that don't require that electric cooling. So,
okay,
you have to.
Well, an email here then for Mr. Moglen. This came in from Georgia in the USA, from Jacob Lovell, who wrote in saying, the problem is not nuclear energy itself, but Japan's use of it. The country is prone to earthquakes and tsunamis, and its nuclear energy industry has a history of dishonesty. Now, we've touched on this issue of the seismic activity, but what do you think the viewer might be referring to as far as Japan's nuclear energy industry being dishonest?
Well, I think that what we see is that the industry has not leveled with the population for what's really going on, nor do I think that the government has fully disclosed the nature and the impacts of the crisis. But I also want to step back a moment and say something about that, which is that we have a situation here that in part natural disasters have had an impact. Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island did not have tsunamis and they did not have earthquakes. What we have are very old machines run far beyond their lifetime and they fall apart. And then we have human failure, and that's what we also have to contend with.
I have to ask you, then, are you not reassured with the advances? Sorry, Mr. Tucker, let me just ask Mr. Moglen, are you not reassured by the advances that are being made there?
I would really question advances. I mean, what we need to realize, for example, is that of the 104 reactors in the United States, they all broke ground at around the same time that these reactors came online. Our entire reactor fleet ages as well in a similar way.
On the same topic, Mr. Tucker, an email to you from Norway, which touches on this. Sure. Benjamin Bruheim wrote in saying, considering that the Fukushima power station is a relatively old one, it has fared rather well. The biggest risk is posed by the nuclear waste, which are mainly on the site because politicians are afraid of recycling and storing it. If anything, this should teach us how to secure future power plants. And I wonder, on that issue of making the plants safer, you say there is progress. What about the issue of the nuclear waste, which is obviously a big issue in itself?
Well, you just have to look at what France has done. They have a complete reprocessing. You can reprocess 97% of a spent fuel rod, and when they're finished, they have all the waste, all the high-level waste created by 30 years of producing 75% of their electricity. It's all stored beneath the floor of one room in The Hague.
I'm sorry, Mr. Tucker is just completely factually inaccurate. I've spent 10 years working on reprocessing in France. The situation is that through reprocessing, we've dumped a vast amount of radioactive waste directly into the Atlantic Ocean and the Irish Sea. We have plutonium separated out, which is only usable for nuclear weapons. And finally, we have contaminated uranium. We have contaminated uranium, none of which effectively is being used. So what we have is just more nuclear waste and no progress.
Do you think, Mr. Moglen, that what's going on right now with Germany and France and China to some degree is a knee-jerk reaction to what happened in Japan?
I think that there is obviously a response to the searing images on television, but I think that that's a response that's been growing. As we know, Germany has been in the midst of a nuclear phase-out debate, Switzerland in a nuclear phase-out debate. Throughout Europe, the question is, how do we shut down reactors and how do we deal with the waste? So no, I think that what this is doing is actually just turbocharging the public debate, which says nuclear technology is not safe and it's not clean.
Well, Mr. Tucker, an email that came in from Germany, if I may. Our viewers get a chance to ask the questions here as well. So Jan Hoffman has written in saying, No developed nations need atomic energy anymore. Nuclear programs are maintained by subsidies and could easily be replaced by alternative energy sources. How do you regard that?
I think it's kind of uninformed. I don't know what you possibly mean by that. I mean, Japan gets 30% of its electricity, Korea 40%, France 75%. If you think you can replace that with windmills or gerbils turning turbines or something, it's just not there.
I think Mr. Tucker, what the viewer was trying to get at is that the idea that if governments are pumping money into the nuclear industry, this could be redirected to
well, the government hasn't pumped that much money into the nuclear industry. All the plants in the United States were built by private enterprise without any subsidies whatsoever from the government.
That is a factual, as we're hearing again and again, that's a factual inaccuracy of the first order. Right now, what we face in the United States and why we don't have more reactors being built is the investment community is completely unwilling to invest in nuclear technology. And what is going on right now is a discussion about whether or not our government will provide tens of billions of dollars in subsidies, effectively corporate welfare, to the nuclear industry because the investment community won't invest.
Let me ask you, Mr. Moglen, how do you regard the way the U.S. has dealt with the aftermath of the incident in Japan? It's not been as aggressive in checking the nuclear situation as much as Europe has.
Well, I think that first of all, we're not over this situation. I think we're in the midst of a horrific catastrophe, and it is going to continue, unfortunately, to play out. I think that what we have in this country are millions of families watching this on television, and I think that it's having an incredible impact on the general public. And I think that we are going to see the public demanding that old reactors in our backyards are shut down, that spent fuel pools that do not have covers, that do not have protections, are going to need to be dealt with. So I think that what we're going to see is dramatic change and a real change debate in this country. No new reactors, and my guess is we're going to see a drive towards closing old ones.
Of course, Mr. Tucker, for someone like yourself who advocates nuclear power, the issue is this, as you mentioned at the beginning, the fear the public has that each nuclear reactor or each nuclear plant is effectively a bomb waiting to go off. So what's going wrong with, if your argument is right, what's going wrong with the picture presented to the public?
Well, it's hysteria. I mean, the papers have headlines like nuclear cloud and panic. The Daily News this morning was panic, nuclear catastrophe. Bill O'Reilly was talking this morning about if it melts down and Tokyo is right next door with 250 million people, my God, what's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is the reactor will melt down. It doesn't mean there's any release of radioactivity. There's a vast amount of exaggeration and misunderstanding about the nature of what nuclear power is about.
Well, let's get a caller. We've got from Boston, we've got Brian on the line. Brian, thanks for joining us. What would you like to ask?
Well, it's regarding Mr. Tucker's comments. I think it's a little dishonest to say that the reactor survived the earthquake because you can't really separate the earthquake and the tsunami in a country like Japan, particularly when the nuclear plant is on a coastline.
No, Mr. Tucker.
Well, what I mean is they survived the impact of the earthquake. The reactors were doing all right until the tsunami came and washed away the electrical generators.
Mr. Tucker is making an assertion which is completely not borne out by any reasonable facts. What we have is an earthquake, and 60 minutes later we have a tsunami. There is no way of knowing actually what the real damage to those reactors was at that moment. Now what we have is a situation in which we have radiation leaking from 3 nuclear reactors, we have a loss of containment of at least 1 and perhaps 2, and we have fires in spent fuel ponds, which is an utterly catastrophic situation. And if he doesn't like the word catastrophic, he needs to ask why the nuclear industry in Europe is using that phrase. We are really in the midst of a horrific catastrophe, and his empty rhetoric doesn't cover that up.
Mr. Tucker, I'll give you a chance to respond to this. Of course, the situation is pretty bad, and it seems to be getting worse.
Well, I don't know whether it's getting worse. The latest I heard is that the radiation levels were down a little bit, and workers had gone back into the site. We don't know. My sense is that no news is good news because those reactors are cooling down of their own accord, and it's a question of nursing them through this process. But there has been damage to the containment, and there are fires and there are hydrogen explosions.
Again, if Mr. Tucker were actually aware of the fact is that nuclear reactors do not cool down by themselves, nor do the spent fuel ponds, and that's part of the problem. Because they're not being cooled, the fuel is melting in the reactors, and because the spent fuel ponds are not being cooled, we may see more fires and even criticalities in those ponds.
Let me ask you one thing, Mr. Moglen, an email that we got from Ghana, from Accra, where Williams Kwame wrote in saying, the so-called civilized world should understand that nature cannot be cheated. It will catch up with you one way or the other. Now, I mean, is this really cheating nature? Because a lot of people would say that fossil fuels are actually cheating nature more.
Oh, that's an interesting question.
That was actually for Mr. Moglen first, but I'll get back to you in a second, Mr. Tucker. But
Sure.
Mr. Moglen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, it's totally clear that reactors should never have been built in these places. And it's completely arrogant to think that we should have been building them there. The reactors were never designed to withstand these kind of accidents, and they don't, and it's very clear. As to whether or not other things are nature catching up, the use of coal creating climate change, indeed, as we begin to understand and learn more, we see the ways in which that's happening.
Let me ask you, Mr. Moglen, could you see a time, if technology is advanced enough and, of course, the location of you know, the setting is right, could you see a valid argument for nuclear reactors, assuming the technology is reached to a level where you feel comfortable with the safety?
I think we have to set up a series of criteria to hold nuclear power to. First of all, it has to be safe. Second of all, it has to be clean, which means you don't continue nuclear power unless you know what to do with the waste. And given that the waste is around for tens of thousands of years, that's a big if. The next problem is you don't have nuclear power and not have nuclear weapons. Nuclear power and nuclear weapons are inextricably linked. So we also have to decide whether or not we accept the notion of weapons as well. So there are a series of criteria that would need to be met. If we can meet those, let's see.
Mr. Tucker, an email to you, sir, as well, that came in from our viewer by the name of Dav O, who wrote in saying, having grown up close to a reactor, I have to argue in favor of nuclear power. It is safe if reactors are built, maintained, and operated properly. Ultimately, can one ever prepare for the unexpected? But I wonder, in your opinion, how much the authorities or even individuals could actually prepare for something unexpected at a nuclear plant? I mean, for example, what might have been done differently in Japan to avoid what's happened?
Well, you could have built the containment thicker. You could have had extra sets of batteries on hand. I think that the best way would be to move forward with the technology, which would mean the passive, simplified passive reactors that don't require electricity. And ultimately, there's a new technology of small reactors, of reactors about 1/10 the size of the ones we're building now. And they are going to be much safer because they're smaller, they don't get as hot, you can bury them, you can put it in a basement somewhere and power a town of 20,000 people. I think the direction of nuclear technology may be actually towards small reactors.
I think it's really important to realize that what Mr. Tucker is talking about is fantasy land. All of the things he's talking about don't exist. And nobody wants them to exist.
They exist on submarines.
Nobody who is watching what is going on in Japan wants a nuclear reactor in their basement. That's ridiculous.
Well, let me ask you, Mr. Tucker. I mean, the same way I asked Mr. Moglen about, you know, nuclear plants being safe and everything being having the right checks and balances. I wonder, could you see the kind of investment into alternative energies that might actually negate the need to have nuclear power, to be able to actually get the right kind of energy supply from solar power, wind power, and other alternative methods?
There's not a chance. The simple physics of it, in order to replace a standard nuclear plant, you would have to cover about 400 square miles with windmills. As soon as everybody's for these alternate energies, until you start to build the facilities, and then all of a sudden everybody comes out of the woodwork. No, we don't want solar collectors in the desert. No, we don't want small dams. No, we don't want big dams. No, we don't want gasohol. No, we don't want anything, basically, is what they say.
David Moglen, 30 seconds, basically. Let me ask you, I mean, obviously the jury is still out to some degree on what's happened in Japan. When do you think, you know, in your opinion, we'd have an idea of the final picture?
I'm afraid that this is going to play out over weeks now, and I think it could even be months. And I think that then what's going to happen is that we're going to have to do long-term radiation assessments of the poor people who've been contaminated. Because remember, cancers may take 10, 20, 30 years to set in, and that's what we've seen at Chernobyl.
Well, of course, this is a debate that could go on. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but David Moglen, I thank you, and William Tucker, I thank you too, sir, for joining our debate.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us with your questions too. Remember, you can follow the program on Twitter. We'll keep you notified on upcoming shows, and you can send us questions and comments to pose to our guests. On the next show, state governments take on organized labor. We speak with activist and politician Ralph Nader about the future of workers' unions in the United States. Make sure you tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.